I love the loud announcement, the automated voice. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today to talk about the unfortunately timely topic of building homes in wildfire zones. For those who do not know me, my name is Jake Price, and I am the Business Development Manager of the Housing Action Coalition. And I think we have mostly familiar faces, but for those who are maybe a little bit newer to our work, HAC is a member-supported nonprofit that advocates for building more homes at all levels of affordability to help alleviate the Bay Area and California's housing shortage, displacement, and affordability crisis. So one of the many things that I'd like to think we do well is bring on exceptional interns. And in a moment, I'm going to turn the program over to two of our summer interns, Mella Betag and Natalie Green, who are the two interns who led on this research and will be doing the presentation on homes in wildfire zones. But first, before we get started, I'd like to go around and do some introductions. So those of you who have been to our regulatory committee and project review know kind of how this works. I'll just go around and say your name. If you can just give a quick name, what organization you're with, or if you don't have an affiliated organization, if you're just here as a friend, feel free to say that as well. So I'll get started. My name is Jake, and I'm with HAC. And I'll call out names. So I think I'm going to go in order on my screen, which is HAC people first, seemingly. So Deborah.
I'm Deborah Schneider. I'm HAC's Communications Director.
Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie Green, and I'm an intern at HAC this summer.
Mella.
Hi, I'm Mella Betag, and I'm also an intern at HAC this summer.
Is it Dina or Deanna?
It's Deanna, and
Deanna.
I'm Deborah's mother. So
Great.
happy to be here.
Thank you for coming. Corey.
Corey Smith, Deputy Director of the Housing Action Coalition.
Lucy.
I'm Lucy, and I'm an intern at HAC.
Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dumont, and I'm an architect at Steinberg Hart.
Great. Carrie.
Carrie, hi.
Yes.
I'm a volunteer tenant counselor with Housing Rights Committee.
Welcome. Nico.
Hi, Nico Nagel. I'm HAC's East Bay organizer.
Kat.
Hi, Kat Wortham. I am HAC's South Bay and Peninsula organizer.
Lauren Scott.
Hi, I'm an urban planner with MIG.
Welcome. John.
John Laws. I am a former principal with DCI Engineers in San Francisco, recently retired.
Congratulations and welcome.
Thank
you. Lisa.
Hi, Lisa Greene here. I am a friend of the family, but also Natalie Green's mom.
Great. Megan.
I'm a PhD student, but I was just interested in the topic because I grew up in California and wildfires didn't used to be a thing as much.
Yep. Yeah. We now have a full season dedicated to it, unfortunately. So with that, thank you all for joining. Thank you for introducing yourselves. And I am going to turn it over to Natalie and Mella, who will be leading the program.
Thanks so much, Jake. I will share my screen now. If it works, one moment. I apologize, everyone. It's taking a while to load. Technology is not on my side right now.
No problem.
Does somebody, like Deborah, do you mind sharing it? Does that, or
I can do that. Unless you,
the co-host?
yeah, or Natalie, if you want me to, I can.
Yeah, if you could.
Okay, let me find it, but I have it.
Oh, here I can.
I am so sorry, everyone. I don't
Oh, no
know.
problem. It would be weird if something didn't happen with technology.
Very good point.
All right, thank you. I am sharing my screen.
All right.
All good? Okay.
Cool. And with that sort of rocky start, welcome to our Summer Friends of Hack event. This is centered on building in wildfire zones 101. And as you have probably all seen in the news, this topic is becoming increasingly important and also dangerous. And there's a lot of new legislation coming down the pipeline surrounding this issue. So it's kind of an exploration of this topic and an overview because it's developing pretty fast. All right, so a little more introductions. Hi, my name is Natalie Green. I am a rising junior at the Ruth Asawa School of the Arts High School here in San Francisco. And the reason that I joined HACK this summer is because I am a pretty big environmental advocate, and this issue is the environmental issue is pretty intersectional with the housing crisis. And so that's kind of what got me interested in it and also led me to being part of this presentation. And I'll pass it on to Mella.
Hi, everyone. As you heard before, my name is Mella Betag. I am a rising senior at Lowell High School in San Francisco. I joined HACK because I am also interested in environmental issues and general issues that face the Bay Area, including housing. So, yeah. And next slide. So I just want to go over our quick agenda for the day. First, we're going to do a quick overview of the pressing issues of wildfires in California and what exactly that means. Then on to what wildfire zones are. And then we'll be diving into some of the details of building and housing in wildfire zones. We'll be exploring some different pathways to building, stopping development, rebuilding, increasing density, etc., etc. Finally, finishing up with a little conclusion on what's next in the issue, and then we'll move on to questions. So you're welcome to drop questions in the chat during our presentation, and we can get to them at the end, and also having questions from you guys at the end if you want to speak. So first things first, the issue of wildfires. Next slide. As you can see, we have a graph here of the acres burned every year in California. And the trend is pretty obvious. You can see that the 5-year average has been on the increase. Fires are getting worse every year. And Natalie has dropped a link in the chat if you want to explore a little bit more about increasing area of wildfires in California. Next slide. And living in California, it's pretty obvious. We've all experienced the increase of smoke during fire season, and I'm sure some of us have direct connections to people who have been hurt by the fire or have been hurt ourselves by the fires. And we have this thing called fire season, which has now become regular, but let's put some numbers behind that experience. Last year, 10,488 structures were damaged or destroyed. Fire season in California is estimated to have increased by 75 days since last year, now from June to July to about September. This year, there have already been 5,609 incidents of wildfire in California. Compared to this time last year, which was around 3,847 fires. So we can already see we have more fires, and this year is increasingly worse. And already 323 structures have been damaged or burnt by fires. And the destruction of these structures leads to some huge financial losses. The average between 2014 and 2018 in residential property loss was $310,496,110. That is a significant amount of money. There is also significant displacement due to fires. In Paradise in 2018, the population went from 26,000 to 3,000. So wildfires are creating big shifts right now. It's clearly an issue.
All right, so like Mella said, this is clearly an issue and it's gotten increasingly worse, but what are actually wildfire zones and how are they made? Next slide. So fire zones are created based on these fire hazard elements. As you can see on the slide, there's vegetation, topography, weather, crown fire potential, ember production and movement, and the likelihood of an area burning within a given amount of time. So the fire risk is determined from these standards and then given a specific risk. And then this hazard risk influences the implementation of building standards and local policies within that area, depending on how pressing that risk is. And then lastly, it just shows where the state has financial responsibility to wildland fire protection. Next slide. So here is a map of the fire zones in Bay Area. You can see red indicates very high risk, orange indicates high risk, yellow indicates moderate risk, and then light gray is non-wildland or non-urban land, and dark gray is urban unzoned. So you can see in the Bay Area, the most hazardous fire areas are the hills in the East Bay, also near Half Moon Bay on the southern peninsula, and then also some patches near Mill Valley. And then also these zones were created in 2007, but obviously the landscape is changing really fast, and because of climate change, the fires are getting worse and these zones are changing. And so these zones will probably be expanded in the near future, but right now this is what we're working with. Next slide.
So now that we know kind of about our landscape of wildfires and wildfire zones, how does this all affect housing? That's what we're here for after all, right? Next slide. So let's look at some data for housing in risky areas in California. Currently, there are about 1.4 million dwelling units in these areas, and there is the capacity for an additional 500,000 units. So if we were to continue to build, we would have 500,000 units more to build in that land. And following current development trends, an additional 600,000 units will be developed in high fire risk areas in 2050. So if we took no consideration to those fire zones, we could gain an extra 645,000 units in those zones. So your initial reaction might be one of two ways. Either no, we shouldn't build at all. These fires are far too risky. Absolutely no building. Or yes, we need to build. We have a housing crisis, as we all know. And we have the space for so many houses in these zones. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So there are a few different approaches to this problem. It's not just to build or not to build. And we're going to use a model that UC Berkeley recently used. They did some research into this, and we're going to use some of the language that they did. So they went with 3 different kind of models of building in these zones. 1, which is rebuilding or developing as usual. 2, something they call resilience nodes. And 3, something they call managed retreat. So we're going to go into each of these possible routes of development now. So the first possible approach is rebuilding or developing as usual. Now let's make the distinction really quickly that rebuilding from a fire takes slightly different considerations from just developing in vulnerable zones that have not yet been burned, because you're dealing with actual displacement. So let's recognize that rebuilding does mean less displacement for people in burned regions. However, rebuilding and developing is incredibly expensive. It would cost $610 billion to replace housing in high-risk areas that's there right now, even without added development. And with the added cost of insurance, creating housing in fire areas costs even more. Insurance is rising incredibly fast in these regions, so it's becoming increasingly hard to finance houses here. Besides all of this, there's also the other aspect of rebuilding as usual, which is we're putting people in harm's way without changing anything. And this goes for development too. These houses are not necessarily safe to live in. And you're creating housing stock that is very vulnerable to being destroyed. It's risky to create these buildings. So while you might be creating significantly more units, is it worth it in the long run if they're going to burn?
Okay, so the second potential approach is what the study called resilience nodes. And this is essentially just building safely with damage control. So that includes increased building standards, defensible land, and green belts. And we'll go over that in a moment. So the first method of damage control is building standards. And this is just to make houses stronger against wildfires and also create easy evacuation routes. So the first one is Wildland Urban Interface, also known as WI, building standards for new construction. And this is just building new houses that are able to, or are trying to mitigate the risk of wildfires. And then there's also natural hazard real estate disclosure, which is just, saying if you are selling a house, then you are disclosing that you're in a high-risk fire zone. There's also proper road widths, water supply, and signage, and that's just to provide adequate warning, and also helping, again, to try to protect against these wildfires. There's also fire-resistant materials and fire-retardant wood. There's also roof gutters. So the roof gutters are helpful because there's things like dried leaves and twigs on roofs, which are really great fuel for fire. And so roof gutters kind of help shovel all that out. And then there's also ventilation in attics. Yeah. There's also, also for the previous slide, I just want to add that 86% of homes built without these standards burned, compared to 49% of ones that did have these standards. So they are actually effective. And a lot of local governments have been a little bit hesitant to enact these building standards because they're expensive. However, they are pretty effective, so it is worth it. Okay, moving on, there is defensible land, which is 100 feet of space around homes and other buildings, and the homeowner is responsible for maintaining that area. And one of the reasons that led to the destruction of the fire in Paradise was that many houses had far too little space between them, and so the fire was able to spread really easily and destroy a lot of homes. However, a lot of governments have found that this is difficult to enforce, but it does considerably reduce the risk of wildfire spreading. So, because it allows firefighters to save properties without it spreading as fast. And then there's also green belts, which are somewhat similar, but it is more natural integrated green areas, which can provide either a moisture barrier or also just a territory that can be defended by firefighters. And this was used by Greenbelt Alliance because they're a large advocate of them. And greenbelts can include parks, agricultural land, zones in subdivisions, and recreational greenways, which are like golf courses, bike paths, that sort of thing. So there's been some recent legislation about what the study called resilience nodes. So the first one is SB 12, which was actually recently discarded, but it still shows that this has been increasingly part of the conversation. And SB 12 would have overhauled safety guidelines for developing areas with very high risk of wildfires. It would require state and local authorities to amend land use policies to account for fire hazards. And it would also ban certain developments in high-risk zones unless projects met enhanced requirements. And it drew criticism from the California Building Industry Association because it made a lot of new projects infeasible, which is one of the reasons that it was discarded. However, it does show that this has been increasingly part of the conversation. There's also SB 63, which is currently passing through the California Senate. And that includes the expansion of fire safety standards. It has the adoption of several fuel modification practices. It has development of local defensible space and home hardening programs, and also reporting on funds spent related to fire prevention efforts.
So then managed retreat is the last potential approach to this question of do we build or do we not build in wildfire zones? And managed retreat essentially means discouraging all building in wildfire zones, including rebuilding, and focusing energy on moving those people in threatened zones to new areas. And this includes encouraging infill housing and encouraging units being built in places that aren't wildfire zones. Next slide. So there are several good examples of this idea of managed retreat. The first example is the Tubbs Fire in Santa Rosa and Sonoma County in 2017. First of all, let me explain the fire a little bit. Around 5,000 buildings were ultimately destroyed in the burning. So what did this do to the housing market in the arena? Well, it certainly didn't help. It destroyed 5% of the housing stock, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually makes a pretty big difference. Due to the fire, Santa Rosa went from needing 5,000 units of housing to needing 8,000. So it was already in a housing shortage, and this significantly worsened it. Some people rebuilt their homes, but those who did it much more expensively because they had to create more sturdy homes and had to fireproof their homes, which is considerably more expensive. And overall, Santa Rosa decided instead of focusing on rebuilding these expensive and risky housing, they should focus on pushing for more development in safer regions. For example, infill housing in downtown Santa Rosa. For example, they decided to expedite permits in the region in order to move as many people out of the dangerous zones as possible. Next slide. let's look at the most pertinent example of this fight in the Bay. And this is the possible ban on creating ADUs in the Oakland Hills, which are designated as high-risk fire severity zones. They are the gray region on this map, and this is Oakland. So that zone includes most of the hills with a very rough bottom boundary along Highway 13 and along I-580 from Mills College to San Leandro. And in some cases, it also includes the neighborhoods below those freeways. This is a pretty large change from what it is currently. Right now, ADUs can be built anywhere in the hills, except for some very narrow sections in which it's not very open for possible evacuation. But there has been a lot of pushback against this ban. The public laid out reasons for supporting development in this zone. So from what you've heard so far, you're probably thinking it's pretty good to ban these things, but there are reasons not to, and a lot of public members have brought these up. So we'll go into this in the next slides. So the first issue is equity. Now, you might think, what does banning ADUs have anything to do with equity? And I was confused at first too, but we can look into it. So first, on the left, you can see that the hills are predominantly white, as indicated by the blue. And then on the right, you can see that the hills are predominantly high income, as indicated by the green and the purple. Next slide. Thirdly, the hills already have less affordable housing, as indicated by the red on this map on the left. And finally, the hills have almost entirely single-family zoning, as compared to downtown Oakland, indicated by the pink on this map. And similar patterns have been found in other fire zones in the Bay, where similar restrictions on development due to wildfire concerns could be coming. Next slide. So why is this an issue? Well, as many have pointed out, if further development is prohibited in this neighborhood because they are wildfire zones, like the banning of ADUs, then the burden of building more units is pushed from these affluent white single-family neighborhoods to less affluent neighborhoods of color that may already not be single-family. Because of this, people have questioned laws blocking building in wildfire zones, saying, if they're dangerous for new buildings, why are we still letting anyone live there? And NIMBYs have had a history of adopting pro-environmental stances in order to block any and all housing, and some opposition for measures like this could be from that. Just to let you know, this ban is still being debated now. They were planning on deciding it beginning of June, but there was a lot of pushback, so they have moved that decision up. So currently not in legislation, but still being considered. Next slide. So now that we've explored some different levels of development in these regions, we can draw some conclusions on what is best, considering both the need for housing and the increasing dangers of wildfire zones. As researchers with UC Berkeley concluded, and as we fully agree, rebuilding as usual or continuing developing as usual is the worst. It is costly, it is dangerous for the people living in those houses, and it is ultimately creating housing that is risky to have around. Consider it a really bad investment. However, as we explored with ADUs in the Oakland Hills, complete bans can have unintended consequences too. While ensuring less people, almost no people, are potentially at risk, bans can cause inequity and continue to exacerbate an already starved housing market. If we completely ban rebuilding, then where will we be building the homes? Finally, using harm reduction strategies, as in the example, the resilient nodes scenario, is effective when used correctly. As Natalie said, 86% of homes built without building standards burned in fires, compared to 49% of ones that did use building standards. So using things like building standards and green belts are effective, if costly.
All right, so after those findings, the study just went into what's next and some recommendations for that. So they came up with a few recommendations. First of all, just more funding for adaptation and recovery costs, because like we've said, this is pretty expensive. And so it just needs more funding overall. And they recommend that this can be done by putting a small fee on houses in high and very high wildfire zones. And they estimated that it would generate about $1.8 billion for the state, and that could be used for funding. Secondly, preventing displacement through the resilience node we talked about earlier, particularly for low-income homeowners that are overrepresented in these high-risk wildfire zones. And then third, push low-risk development such as infill housing at all income levels to limit wildfire zone sprawl. And this is simply, if we add density to low-risk areas, we have less need to spread out to high-risk wildfire areas. And then fourth, building capacity at regional and local levels.
Notice how the third point directly aligns with the Housing Action Coalition's goals. And really, if we're pushing for infill housing in the city, this is not a pertinent question we need to have. So focusing on that is key. So that's the end of our main body of research. If anybody has any questions, you'd be welcome to put them in the chat or unmute and ask them. We're open to anything.
I'll kind of start, and I know this is something I've seen that plays a role in this. They've talked about insurance a fair amount. My mom lives in an area that's considered a wildfire zone, and there's rumors that insurance companies are dropping coverage for houses. How do you think that all plays out? And I guess in your research, is that happening? What's going to happen? It's a little bit more, I guess, opinions from the two of you, but what are your thoughts?
Mella, you can go into this a little more, but what I've seen from the research is that what we went over in the slide is that obviously insurance costs are just rising in those areas, but also some insurance companies were just altogether dropping policies in those regions. However, I think there was a state law that was passed that said that insurance companies could not drop policies because of in wildfire zones. So that, I think that's the most current update, but I don't know, Mella, if there was anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a consideration. I read of several stories of people whose insurance were going up twofold, threefold, pretty insane amounts, which is definitely a consideration when it comes to building housing in those zones. Is it really affordable if people's insurance is that high? Or if they can't get insured at all, hopefully protections are going in, as Natalie said. But I definitely think that if, as far as we know, insurance is not lowering in those areas, like that's not a trend that we're seeing or are going to see. I suspect that it's just going to continue to go up, especially if they can't drop the policies altogether. They'll just make them incredibly expensive. So I think it's definitely a big consideration for building housing in those zones, because if you're creating housing with huge insurance policies, is it really what we want? But yeah, I'd be happy to send any articles of some examples of that if you want.
And I think it's also important to note that like insurance prices reflects the risk of the house. And if insurance prices are so high, that's just showing even more that it's just so risky to be building exactly the same as we are. So yeah, just another thing to take note of.
I have a question, which is about legislation. You talked about one legislative proposal that didn't make it anywhere, hasn't gone anywhere, and one that's being considered. But what do you both think? What would be your ideal, if you could write the ideal legislation, what would you want to see included in that?
I can go first for this. I think after like all the research that we did, I think the findings from UC Berkeley, I definitely agree with the resilience nodes and things like that. So the recommendations that they had, such as more funding, and then also implementing more building standards, I think that's probably would be my preference and what I would hope to see, because like we said in the presentation, it's not great to just like say, okay, everyone just go. Like that's not really gonna work. And it has, like we said, unintended consequences, but it's also not gonna work if we just keep building the way it is, because that's extremely dangerous and also just costly. So I think the legislation that I would want to see is just increased building standards and defensible land, green belts, and then more funding for that.
Yeah, to add on, I definitely agree with Natalie. I think all of those are good things, but I would also want to see, I would hope to see a little bit of like slightly more comprehensive legislation that not only decreased, like restricted housing in those regions, but also recognize that those people do need places to live. And hopefully in the same legislation pushing for infill housing. I mean, every single source we looked at was just like, don't build in these zones, build in cities. And that's what we say at Housing Action Coalition, and it's agreed upon. So seeing legislation that did both is ultimately the best. Whether that would happen is a different question, but it would be something that I would definitely push for. So yeah.
I have a question about the like building standards and that part of it, where you're kind of, what I took from that, building in the same areas but in a safer way. And you guys had a stat that was like about what like these types of houses burning down versus, you know, houses built normally. But that still kind of seemed high, like it still seemed really high to me, you know, and I just wanted to ask like how worth it you guys think, you know, building in the same areas so that you're not you know, making people move to completely new places, is, you know, even though those houses are still like risky and maybe, you know, not not great for this problem.
I'd be happy to start on this. I think, in my opinion, the difference comes in rebuilding versus development, which we talked about a little bit, but I think the distinction is important. With rebuilding, you already have destroyed communities and people looking to with no house, hoping to move back to where they were, and I think taking care and trying to rebuild a little bit there with building standards and green belts and defensible lands, and using being very careful, but take into consideration that people's homes and communities have been entirely destroyed already, and therefore they might find some solace in trying to return to that, I think is important. Whereas developing in regions that are simply risky, I would not simply rely on building standards and greenbelts and defensible land and these kind of harm reduction strategies, because then you're not taking into consideration people who are already living there. It's really looking for opportunity, and I don't think that's the correct time to, or I guess place to be looking for opportunity. So I would say building standards and things like that are most important for when we're considering rebuilding. But if we're building at all, they should definitely be taken into consideration. So.
And also just to add, like, I don't want to be a downer, but this is just kind of all around a bad situation, and we're just looking at the best option for a bad situation. So I think that's part of it. And then also just, you know, like, we should just increase density in cities where it's safer. But yeah, just trying to make the best of a bad situation, I guess.
So I'm curious about this. Are people living in California seeing this as everybody's problem, or it's just the problem in the red and the orange zone? How is the state looking at, how's the population looking at this?
I mean, I would say personally, or being around people, it's definitely seen as a state problem. I think even though my house is not in danger as I live in an urban region, I still am very affected by the wildfires, and I know many people who have been affected, having their homes burnt. I had a cousin who lived in Paradise who had their homes burnt. I have a friend who is up in Tahoe whose insurance policy is rising significantly. So these are issues that are very connected, even if you're not directly experiencing them. So just from a personal stance, I would say that, like, everyone is pretty concerned. That said, I am an intern at the Housing Action Coalition, which might mean that I am slightly biased and am hearing more from people who are concerned about housing and wildfires. But yeah.
I think that
I can kind of speak from a little bit of perspective on this, because I've recently bought a home, probably not the best idea in a fire zone. And I didn't find out till I was close to closing. I mean, you can look at the maps, but they're not super detailed. And it's the insurance companies that, this is what I learned, have these maps that tell you, you know, what rating you are. And what I was told is that it's 1 to 30. And my zone was like an 8 or 9 of the 30 being the worst. But only the insurance companies seem to have these maps. So even though it was in a lower tier, it was hard to get insurance. And I did spend a couple weeks on this. So I do think that's going to be the issue that drives people. You know, it's the Bay Area in California, so we all take risks on housing. But, you know, a lot of people aren't going to be able to get insurance and be able to resell their homes. But there is the California Fair Plan, which does offer insurance. It's expensive. It's not awful, but it is, yeah, probably 3 times what you would expect.
I also feel like it's just a little impossible to avoid, because while there's an obvious fear of how fire can ruin some of these lives, destroy some of these homes, even if you're not in that environment, the smoke in cities, the smoke in San Francisco makes it impossible to ignore. So even if you're not putting together, oh, there's somebody's home is burning down, you're very aware that it's happening generally, and then that kind of starts the dominoes of bad things are happening.
I mean, I'll also say, like, I'm not sure everyone's making the connection to housing policy, and, you know, solving for homes in wildfire zones is different than solving for wildfires. But I was just at my partner's parents' place in Connecticut, and my sister came up to visit from New York, and like the first thing we talked about at the dinner table was how the air quality in New York is bad because of California. Like, it was like something I had to own. But I mean, the problem of wildfires has certainly gotten bad enough for it to be in the national consciousness. And I don't think it's a huge leap to say, should we be living in those places as a question.
Yeah, and it's, I think, just going to keep getting worse as well, especially if we don't do anything about it, like on a climate change policy level. So yeah, I think it's a little short-sighted to just keep building or just rebuilding at all.
The rebuilding figure, the $610 billion figure that you all found, for rebuilding is really astonishing to me, especially compared to, the amount of money that it's been said to just end homelessness in California is, 10 to $20 billion, $12 billion, something like that. I mean, it's really quite stunning.
Yeah, and I would like to note that that is just costs of housing that's already there if it were to be damaged. So not even discussing whether further development is going to be there, that's a big cost. So building housing in those zones would be very risky, to say the least. Just financially. It's interesting.
Any other questions from the audience? All right. So I think with that, we are going to close this presentation, and I want to give another thank you to Natalie and Mella for an excellent presentation, and thank you everyone for tuning in and for participating and being great active listeners. And Michelle, yes, we recorded this, so we will have this public, and I'm sure if you'd like to see the slides, Deborah or Natalie can send those over to you. And anyone else who's interested, we'll send them out.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Good job, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I thought we were going to have an after party with the moms.
They're out of there.
That was awesome, you guys.
I think that went well.
It was really great.
Smoothest run. So
well, there you go.
It helped that you were sharing, I have to say.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was a little bit slow on that, but
no, that was great.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense. Now we know. Now we know. That's a good idea.
Yeah, sorry for putting you on the spot.
Oh yeah, no. I'm so glad I had access to it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Good.
I'm gonna head off to bed.
Yes, please. Thank you so much for staying up so late.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And for everything. Yeah, that was awesome. And thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for taking time out of your overseas travels to present. That was really, you guys did a really great job.
Thank you.
Really great job. So thank you. So yeah, we'll let you go, and Jake and I'll connect about just sending out follow-up stuff to people. And we will send to everybody who registered for the event, not just the people who attended, but everyone who's on the registration list. So so that'll be good. And I will, by I mean Eric, my husband, and I will edit we'll edit the presentation. We'll have it on YouTube, and we will share it far and wide across all of our channels.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you guys. Okay. Bye.
Bye.